She forged our father's signature to steal the estate. The words landed in courtroom for be like a dropped glass. My sister's lawyer, a sharp-suited man named Griggs who billed $400 an hour to make my life difficult, slid a folder of photographs across the table toward Judge Marsh. Blown-up images of a signature, Dad's signature, or something built to look like it, sat beside a genuine sample pulled from his old passport. Camille sat at the plaintiff's table in a cream Chanel suit she definitely couldn't afford anymore, arms crossed, chin tilted at the exact angle she'd used since we were kids, whenever she wanted an adult to believe her over me. She caught my eye and smirked. That smirk. I'd been on the receiving end of it since I was 7 years old and she was 9. The day she told our mother I'd broken her music box when she'd broken it herself reaching for a cookie she wasn't supposed to have. Judge Marsh, a woman with reading glasses perched low on her nose and a reputation for not suffering theatrics, leaned forward over the folder. Counsel, you're alleging the defendant fabricated a legal document to redirect $3.4 million in estate assets to herself. That's correct, Your Honor, Griggs said. Ms. Vanessa Cole altered her father's final financial instructions in the weeks before his death, isolating him from other family members and manipulating him into signing documents that funneled the bulk of his estate, the house on Ashland, the investment accounts, the rental properties, into her sole name. My client only discovered the fraud after her father's passing, when the will was read and she found herself with almost nothing. I sat at the defense table with my hands folded, my own attorney, a quiet, unglamorous man named Peter Ilyanov, beside me. I said nothing. 12 years of sitting across from far more sophisticated liars than my sister had taught me that the first person to react loses the room. Miss Cole, Judge Marsh said, addressing me directly, your sister's counsel has presented what appears to be a signature comparison from a licensed document examiner. Do you have a response? I stood, smoothed the front of my blazer, kept my voice even. Your Honor, I do. But before I respond, I'd like to call a witness. My sister's own retained expert. A ripple went through the gallery. Griggs blinked, recalibrating. Your Honor, the plaintiff hasn't rested her case. I'm calling her as a witness under subpoena, not cross-examining prematurely, I said. She's already on the witness list. I'd simply like to move her testimony forward. Judge Marsh studied me for a long moment, the kind of look I'd learned to recognize after a decade of watching juries and judges try to decide whether someone was bluffing. Granted. Ms. Reyes, please take the stand. A woman in her 50s rose from the gallery, straightened her blazer, and walked toward the witness box with the particular stiffness of someone who suspected, correctly, that her day was about to get complicated. Her name was Denise Reyes. Forensic document and financial examiner, 22 years in the field, hired by my sister's legal team to prove I'd stolen from a dying man. She didn't know yet that she was about to prove the opposite. Part 2. What came before. To understand why I was sitting in that courtroom instead of falling apart, you have to understand what our house was like growing up and what I built quietly in the years after I left it. Our mother died when I was 6 and Camille was 8. A brain aneurysm, sudden, no warning, the kind of loss that reorganizes a household overnight. Dad, a mechanical engineer at a mid-sized manufacturing firm in the Chicago suburbs, was left with 2 daughters and no idea how to raise either of us. He did what a lot of grieving, overwhelmed parents do. He found it easier to love the child who performed happiness for him and harder to know what to do with the one who processed grief quietly. Camille performed. She was luminous even as a child, effortlessly charming, the kind of kid who could cry on cue and mean it just enough to be convincing. Dad called her his sunshine. I was the responsible one, which sounds like a compliment until you're the one hearing it every single day in place of anything warmer. By the time we were teenagers, the pattern was set in stone. Camille got the car when she turned 16, a used Civic, but a car. I got a bus pass and a part-time job at a copy shop. Camille's homecoming dress cost more than my school books for the semester. When I brought home a report card with 4 A's and a B, Dad asked why the B. When Camille brought home a report card with 2 D's, Dad blamed the teachers. I don't say this to build a sympathy case. I say it because it's the reason I became who I became. There's a specific memory I return to more than the others, not because it was the cruelest thing that happened in that house, but because it was the smallest, and small things are usually the ones that actually shape you. I was 14. I'd saved for 11 months, babysitting the neighbors' twins every weekend, to buy a used trumpet so I could join the school jazz band, the one extracurricular I'd ever wanted badly enough to work for. 3 days before I picked it up from the pawn shop, Camille needed $200 for a dress for a dance she hadn't been invited to yet, banking on an invitation that never came, and Dad took it from the envelope in my sock drawer without asking, because he assumed, correctly, that I wouldn't make a scene about it. I never got the trumpet. I got a lecture 3 weeks later about how family means sharing what you have. Camille never wore the dress. Nobody ever mentioned the trumpet again except me, alone, for years. That's not a story about music. It's a story about who got asked and who got assumed. By the time I left for college, I'd stopped keeping money anywhere Dad could find it, and I'd stopped, without quite realizing I was doing it, expecting anyone in that house to notice, when something mattered to me. I got a partial scholarship to University of Illinois and worked 30 hours a week on top of a full course load to cover the rest, waiting tables at a diner off campus that smelled permanently of burnt coffee and bacon grease. I studied accounting because it felt like the opposite of our house, something with rules, something where the numbers either matched or they didn't, where nobody's charm could talk a ledger into balancing when it wouldn't. In my last year of school, a professor named Dr. Okafor recommended me for an internship at a firm that specialized in something I didn't know existed: forensic accounting. Following money. Finding the places where someone's story didn't match their bank statements. I was 21 years old the first time I helped trace $600,000 a bookkeeper had quietly siphoned from a family construction business over 9 years, one invoice at a time, small enough each time that nobody noticed until it wasn't small anymore. Something in me clicked into place. I understood, finally, viscerally, why I'd always felt calmer with numbers than with people. Numbers didn't lie to make you feel better. People did that. Numbers just sat there, waiting for someone patient enough to actually look. 12 years later, I was a senior partner at Hallbrook Krantz, a boutique forensic accounting firm that did work for law firms, courts, and insurance companies across the Midwest, untangling embezzlement, tracing hidden assets in divorces, testifying as an expert witness in fraud trials from Milwaukee to St. Louis. My name was on filings in 3 states. I'd built, cell by careful cell, a reputation as someone who could find what other people had buried. My family had no idea, not because I was ashamed, because I'd learned, the hard way, that the moment money entered a conversation with Camille or Dad, everything else evaporated: the relationship, the honesty, the possibility of just being loved without an angle. I drove a 9-year-old Honda Civic. I lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Logan Square that I could have upgraded from years ago. I told my father I did corporate accounting, boring stuff, whenever he asked, and he never asked twice, because Camille's latest drama always filled the air before mine got a chance to. I wasn't hiding out of shame. I was watching. I wanted, at least once in my adult life, to know whether my own father would treat me differently if he thought I had nothing worth wanting from me. He never got the chance to prove me wrong, and some nights that's the thing that keeps me awake more than anything Camille ever did. There was a practical layer to the silence, too, one I didn't fully admit to myself until years later. Forensic accounting runs on discretion. Half my clients were law firms handling divorces where hidden assets were the entire battlefield. The other half were companies who just discovered someone inside their own walls had been quietly bleeding them for years and needed that fact to stay out of the local paper until the investigation closed. My name showing up in a family financial dispute, even an imagined one, even gossip at a barbecue, could have created a conflict of interest headache for cases I was actively working. So the boring cover story wasn't just emotional armor. It was professional hygiene. Corporate accounting, boring stuff, closed the conversation in 4 seconds flat, and 4 seconds was all I ever wanted that conversation to take. Part 3. The quiet years. My life outside the family wasn't small, even if my family never saw it. I had David, my partner of 6 years, an ER physician at Rush who understood better than anyone what it meant to carry other people's crises without absorbing them personally. We'd met when I testified as an expert witness in a fraud case involving a hospital administrator, and he'd been called as a fact witness the same week. We joked that we bonded over cross-examination. I had Priya, my best friend since grad school, now a partner at her own firm across town, who I met for trail runs along the North Branch every Saturday morning regardless of weather, rain or 10-degree cold, because the running was never really about the running. I mentored, twice a month, at a community program that taught basic financial literacy and bookkeeping to teenagers aging out of the foster system. Kids who, like me, had learned early that nobody was going to hand them stability, and that the surest way to build it themselves was to understand exactly where every dollar went. I never told my family about that either. It wasn't for them. And I had my work, real work, meaningful work, the kind that let me sleep at night. 2 years before my father died, I'd led the forensic examination in a case that recovered $11 million a hospital's own CFO had embezzled through shell vendor contracts over a decade. The case made regional news. My name was in it. My father, scrolling his phone during a family dinner Camille had convinced him to host, never looked up. I built the life he never saw, because I'd stopped expecting him to look, and I'd made peace with that a long time before he died. I thought I had, anyway. Grief has a way of proving you wrong about what you've made peace with. Part 4. The Death and What Followed. Dad died on a Tuesday in March, a heart attack in his sleep at 68, no warning, the same kind of sudden, cruel absence that had taken our mother 30 years earlier. I got the call from a neighbor at 6:40 in the morning and drove to the house on Ashland in a fog so thick I don't remember the highway at all, just arriving. Camille was already there when I pulled up, which struck me as strange, since she and Dad had barely spoken in the 2 months before his death over an argument about her latest failed business venture, a boutique fitness studio that had drained $40,000 of his retirement savings before folding. In the weeks after the funeral, I handled what needed handling: the death certificate, the funeral home, the estate attorney, the endless small administrative cruelties of closing out a life. Camille handled her grief the way she'd always handled everything, loudly, publicly, and in a way that required everyone around her to manage it for her. 6 weeks after the funeral, the will was read. Dad had split the estate evenly between us in a will drafted 8 years earlier. The house, worth around $650,000, 2 rental properties worth roughly $1.1 million combined, and an investment portfolio just under $1.7 million, all split 50-50. Roughly $3.4 million total, half to each of us. Camille didn't take it well. Not because it wasn't generous. It was, but because in the years leading up to Dad's death, she developed the quiet, expensive habit of borrowing against an inheritance she assumed would eventually be entirely hers, since she'd always been the favorite, since she'd always gotten more. She had debts. Real ones. A gambling problem she'd never admitted to, connected to online sports betting that had metastasized during the isolation of the pandemic years, along with 2 max lines of credit and a car loan 6 months delinquent. 3 months after the will was read, I was served with a lawsuit. I remember the exact moment. A process server found me in the parking garage under my office building on a Thursday evening, handed me a manila envelope with my name typed across the front, and said, "Vanessa Cole," like it was a question, even though he clearly already knew the answer. I stood there in the fluorescent half-light of the garage reading the caption, Camille R. Cole versus Vanessa L. Cole, for what felt like 10 minutes before I could make myself walk to my car. I'd spent 12 years reading complaints like this one from the outside, professionally detached, following the money without ever being the money. Seeing my own name on both sides of AV rearranged something in my chest that no client file ever had. I called David first, then Priya, then, after an hour of pacing my kitchen deciding whether it was worth it, my Aunt Ruth, who'd always occupied an uneasy middle ground in our family, loving us both but never quite willing to referee between us. Ruth's first question wasn't, "Are you okay?" It was, "Did you do it?" And something in the 2-second pause before she asked told me she already suspected the answer was more complicated than either of us wanted it to be. Part 5. The Claim. The complaint alleged that in the final weeks of Dad's life, I had visited him alone. True, I had, several times, because someone needed to help him manage his medications and I'd taken time off work to do it, and had produced a handwritten codicil, purportedly signed by him, that redirected a disproportionate share of liquid assets into a trust naming me as sole beneficiary before his death. The claim was that this codicil, combined with a series of suspicious transfers, amounted to elder financial exploitation and fraud, and that Camille was entitled to $3.4 million in damages representing what she claimed should have been her rightful, larger inheritance under an earlier, informal promise Dad had allegedly made her. It was, on its face, a serious accusation. It was also, on close examination, built on almost nothing, a codicil I'd never seen before Griggs produced it in discovery, a signature that looked close enough to Dad's real one to raise an eyebrow if you weren't looking carefully, and a story that required the court to believe I'd spent 38 years building a quiet, disciplined professional life and then risked all of it, at 40, to defraud a dying man out of assets I could have earned through my own career in about 4 years. Anyway, I didn't panic. I did what I'd been trained to do for 12 years when someone handed me a document that didn't smell right. I started tracing it. I didn't touch the case personally, conflict of interest, obviously, and I wasn't going to let Camille's lawyer paint me as manipulating evidence in my own defense. Instead, I quietly retained an independent document examiner, a colleague I trusted named Marcus Whitfield, who'd worked with me on the hospital embezzlement case 2 years earlier. I gave him every sample of Dad's real signature I could find, his passport, his mortgage refinance from 6 years earlier, a birthday card he'd sent me the year before he died, and asked him to look, carefully and quietly, at the codicil Griggs had produced. I also did something Camille's lawyer never anticipated. I pulled every financial record I had legal access to as co-executor of the estate, bank statements, the rental property accounts, Dad's investment portfolio activity, going back 3 years before his death. Not to build a case against Camille. At first, honestly, just to understand what had actually happened in his final months, because grief makes you want to understand everything, even the parts that don't matter anymore. What I found mattered a great deal. Part 6. What the numbers showed. 18 months before Dad's death, 3 withdrawals had been made from his primary checking account, $9,000 each, structured just under the $10,000 threshold that triggers automatic bank reporting, a pattern forensic accountants learn to recognize within about 4 seconds of looking at a statement, because it's one of the oldest tricks in the book, and one of the most common mistakes amateurs make trying to avoid it. All 3 withdrawals were made in person, at a branch 6 miles from Dad's house and 11 miles from mine, in a neighborhood where Camille had lived at the time. I didn't say anything to anyone. Not to David, not to Priya, not even fully to myself, for almost 2 weeks. I just kept looking. Whitfield came back with his signature analysis 9 days before trial. The codicil's signature showed inconsistent pen pressure, unnatural pauses inconsistent with Dad's known writing speed, and, the detail that mattered most, used a ballpoint ink formulation that, according to a chemical composition test, hadn't existed on the market until 14 months after the date written on the document. Camille had forged it. Not me. Her. I didn't go to the police immediately. Part of me, the part that was still, despite everything, someone's little sister who'd once idolized her, wanted to give her a chance to walk away from the lawsuit quietly. My attorney sent a private letter, off the record, suggesting she reconsider before trial, attaching nothing, revealing nothing, just a door left open. She didn't walk through it. She had Griggs file an amended complaint increasing the damages sought and adding a claim of intentional infliction of emotional distress. She was doubling down. So I stopped protecting her. Part 7. The trial. The trial took 4 days. I want to tell you about all 4, but the only one that mattered, the only one anyone remembers, was the 3rd, the day Denise Reyes took the stand. She'd been retained by Griggs 6 weeks earlier to provide expert testimony supporting Camille's timeline of financial transactions, a routine hire, the kind any competent plaintiff's attorney makes in a case like this. What Griggs hadn't anticipated was that a forensic examiner doing her job properly doesn't just build the case, she's paid to build. She follows the numbers wherever they go, because her professional license depends on her credibility surviving cross-examination, not on her client winning. I stood to question her, having been granted permission to call her out of order. My attorney had prepared the questions with me the night before, but I'd insisted on asking them myself. Some things you don't delegate. Ms. Reyes, you were retained by the plaintiff to review financial records relevant to this case. Is that correct? That's correct. In the course of that review, did you examine account activity for both the plaintiff, Ms. Camille Cole, and the estate accounts in the 18 months prior to Robert Cole's death? I did, yes. She glanced, almost involuntarily, at Griggs, who had gone very still at the plaintiff's table. Did you find anything unusual in the plaintiff's personal bank records during that period? There was a pause. A long one. The kind of silence that fills a courtroom the way water fills a glass. Slow, and then suddenly all the way to the top. Yes, she said finally. I did. Griggs was on his feet. Your Honor, this exceeds the scope of... Sit down, counsel, Judge Marsh said, without raising her voice, which somehow made it worse for him. You retain this witness. You don't get to strike her testimony because you don't like where it goes. Continue, Ms. Cole. I turned back to the stand. Ms. Reyes, can you describe what you found? She opened the folder in front of her, her own report, the one she'd been required to file under oath regardless of who paid her, and read from it in a flat, professional voice that made the words land even harder. I identified 3 structured cash withdrawals from Robert Cole's checking account, each $9,000, made within a 6-week window 18 months before his death. I cross-referenced the branch security logs with the account holder present at each transaction. In all 3 instances, the individual who authorized the withdrawal, using a power of attorney document dated earlier that same year, was Camille Cole. Camille's face, for the first time in the entire trial, lost its practiced composure. Her mouth opened slightly. She turned to Griggs, who wasn't looking at her. Ms. Reyes, I continued, did you also examine the handwriting and ink composition of the codicil submitted as Exhibit 4 in this case? I was asked to review it after Mr. Whitfield's report was shared with counsel as part of discovery reciprocity. Yes. And what did you conclude? That the ink used was manufactured no earlier than 14 months after the document's stated date. In my professional opinion, the document could not have been signed on the date claimed. The gallery, small as it was, my Aunt Ruth, David sitting quietly in the second row, Camille's ex-husband who'd shown up out of what I can only assume was morbid curiosity, went completely silent. One more question, Ms. Reyes. Did Robert Cole grant Camille Cole power of attorney over his finances at any point in the final 2 years of his life? Yes. 11 months before his death. Did he grant me the same authority? No. Your name doesn't appear on any financial authorization documents I reviewed. Griggs stood, visibly rattled, and tried to recover ground on cross. Ms. Reyes, isn't it true that power of attorney is a common and legal estate planning tool, and its existence alone proves nothing improper? That's correct, she said. Power of attorney alone isn't evidence of wrongdoing. So the withdrawals you described could simply reflect Ms. Camille Cole legitimately managing her father's affairs. They could in isolation, Reyes agreed. But that isn't what I found in isolation. I found the withdrawal pattern, the ink chemistry inconsistency in Exhibit 4, and account transfers into a personal account belonging to Ms. Camille Cole opened 4 months before the first withdrawal. Taken individually, each fact has an innocent explanation. Taken together, in my professional opinion, they describe a deliberate pattern. Griggs asked no further questions. He returned to his seat more slowly than he'd stood. I looked at Griggs. I looked at Judge Marsh. I did not look at my sister because I didn't trust what my face would do if I did. Part 8. The ruling. Griggs asked for a recess. Judge Marsh gave him 15 minutes, which he spent in the hallway in a hushed, furious conversation with Camille that I could hear the tone of, if not the words, through the courtroom doors. When they returned, Griggs stood and, in the careful language of an attorney trying to preserve some professional dignity on the way out of a case he'd clearly lost, moved to withdraw the complaint. Judge Marsh denied the motion. Mr. Griggs, your client filed a $3.4 million fraud claim against her sister. We have now heard sworn testimony from your own retained expert establishing that the plaintiff engaged in structured withdrawals consistent with financial exploitation of the decedent, and that a central piece of evidence in this case is a fabricated document. This court doesn't simply let a plaintiff walk away from that once the truth is inconvenient.
She turned to me.
Ms. Cole, do you have anything further?
I stood one more time.
Your Honor, I'd ask the court to refer this matter to the District Attorney's Office for review of possible elder, financial exploitation, and fraud charges related to the withdrawals and the forged codicil. I'd also ask for sanctions to cover the legal costs my sister's lawsuit has forced me to incur over the past 8 months. Granted on both counts, Judge Marsh said. This court finds for the defendant. The plaintiff's complaint is dismissed with prejudice. I am ordering sanctions against the plaintiff in the amount of $650,000 to cover the defendant's legal fees and costs, and I am referring this matter to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office for review of potential criminal charges. Camille didn't scream. I'd almost expected her to. Some part of me braced for the scene she was so good at making. Instead, she just sat there, very still, staring at the table in front of her, while Griggs gathered his files without looking at her either. Behind me, I heard Aunt Ruth exhale, a long, shaking breath she'd apparently been holding since Denise Reyes first took the stand. David reached forward and squeezed my shoulder once, briefly, the way he did after a hard shift at the hospital when there was nothing left to say that would actually help. Camille's ex-husband, 2 rows back, simply stood up and left without a word, and I never found out whether that was disgust at her or at the position her lawsuit had put him in as a witness on the periphery of it all. I felt no triumph. That's the part one wasn't ready for. I'd spent months preparing for this moment, and when it finally arrived, all I felt was a kind of hollow, exhausted grief, because winning this case meant admitting, in the most permanent and public way possible, that my sister had stolen from our dying father and then tried to make me pay for her theft. Part 9, Aftermath. Camille was charged 11 weeks later with financial exploitation of an elderly person and forgery, both felonies under Illinois law. She took a plea deal that spared her a full trial in exchange for restitution and 18 months probation, which felt, to me, both too light and exactly as much as the system was ever going to give either of us. She sold the Chanel suits. She sold the condo she'd bought with money that, it turned out, had come partly from the very withdrawals Denise Reyes testified about. She moved in with our aunt, temporarily, an arrangement that lasted 4 months before Aunt Ruth, who had believed Camille's version of events for years, finally couldn't anymore and asked her to leave. The sanctions judgment went uncollected for the first year. Camille had no assets left to pay it with, and eventually I told my attorney to stop pursuing it. Not out of forgiveness, exactly. I'm still working out what that word means in this context. More because I didn't want to spend one more hour of my life extracting money from someone who'd already lost everything else. I've thought a lot in the months since about why she did it, and I don't think the honest answer is simple greed, even if greed was the mechanism. Camille spent her whole life being told she was the pretty one, the charming one, the one people would take care of, praise that over 3 decades calcified into something closer to a life sentence than a compliment. She was never taught to build anything of her own because she was never expected to need to. When the fitness studio failed, when the credit cards maxed out, when the gambling losses compounded quietly in the background of a life that still had to look, from the outside, like it was going fine, I think she genuinely convinced herself that taking from Dad wasn't stealing. It was collecting early on a debt she believed the universe already owed her. That belief doesn't excuse forging a dying man's signature. It just means the person who did it wasn't a cartoon villain. She was my sister, shaped by the same house that shaped me, and she just never learned the version of resilience I'd been forced to learn by default. That doesn't make the courthouse hallway any warmer. It just means I don't spend much energy hating her. I spend it instead on the parts of my life she was never really part of anyway. We haven't spoken since the sentencing hearing. I don't know if we ever will. Some family relationships don't get a redemption arc. Some of them just end, quietly, in a courthouse hallway, with 2 sisters walking to separate elevators. Part 10. What remains? I still drive the Civic. David and I got married 8 months after the trial, a small ceremony at a forest preserve with 40 guests, none of them named Camille. I made partner at Holbrook Krantz the following spring, a promotion that had been in motion long before any of this started, unrelated and quietly satisfying in a way the courtroom never was. I still run the North Branch Trail with Priya every Saturday. I still mentor at the community program, and last year one of my students, a 19-year-old named Jasmine who'd aged out of foster care with nothing, got her first job as a junior bookkeeper at a firm 2 blocks from mine. I cried in my car in the parking garage after she texted me the news, more than I'd cried at any point during the trial. I visit Dad's grave alone, usually on his birthday, sometimes on the anniversary of his death. I don't bring flowers he'd have appreciated or noticed. I just sit for a while, the way I used to sit at his kitchen table as a kid, quiet, keeping him company without expecting much back, because that's the shape our relationship always took, and some habits outlive the person who taught them to you. People ask me sometimes if I feel vindicated. If proving in a courtroom, in front of a judge, in front of my sister's own expert witness, that I was telling the truth and she wasn't, finally settled something.
I didn't, not really.
I got the money the will always intended for me. I got a legal ruling that confirmed, in the clearest possible terms, what actually happened in the last 2 years of my father's life. What I didn't get, what no court can order into existence, was a sister who loved me without an angle, or a father who saw me clearly while he was still alive to do it. I built a life he never looked at closely enough to be proud of. I won a case that cost me the only sibling I had. Both of those things are true at the same time, and I've stopped waiting for one of them to cancel the other out. Some victories just come with a permanent, quiet weight attached, and you carry it because the alternative, staying quiet, letting the forged signature stand, letting her walk away with money she stole from a dying man, was never really a choice I could live with. I picked truth. I'd pick it again. It still costs something every single day.